I now request Professor Irfan Habib to deliver the keynote address.
Ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a special privilege that I should have been asked to speak at this distinguished gathering, particularly on the theme of, or on the occasion of the 125th birth anniversary of Jawaharlal Nehru. And because I am quite old, I was then a university student. It was seldom that we spoke of the national movement that had been part of our lives, not as actors in it, but as sightseers. Today, the national movement is not only forgotten, but violently misrepresented. And therefore, it is particularly important that when we consider the legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru, we consider, first of all, his contribution to the national movement. I remember as a schoolboy, we didn't know what Karachi Resolution was. But in arguing with the Muslim League class fellows of mine, I used to say, having my elders hear of it, that what have you to offer to Muslims? Just Pakistan? Congress has to offer the Karachi Resolution to Muslims. I didn't know what Karachi Resolution offered. My class fellows also didn't know what it was, but it was something big. Equality to women, democracy, rights to workers, land to the peasant, and particularly control and ownership of basic industries. The state shall own, control key industries and services, mineral resources, railways, waterways, shipping, and other means of public transport. And system of land tenures and revenue shall be reformed, etc., etc. There's no time to read out, but it's clear that when Pandit Nehru drafted his objectives resolution, he had very much the fundamental rights resolution in his mind. In the manifestos for the 1937 elections and 1946 elections, the Congress manifestos, they practically repeated the fundamental rights resolution. So that's Jawaharlal Nehru's contribution, approved by Mahatma Gandhi, but authored entirely by Jawaharlal Nehru, except for rural indebtedness section. Now, this is important because India didn't get simply constitutional freedom, it got freedom for some purpose. And what that purpose was outlined by the Congress, but especially by Jawaharlal Nehru as an individual. Before I pass on to other matters, I would also say that Nehru contributed a very great deal to freedom of thought and the functioning of democracy by his personal conduct and opinions during the national movement. He made it clear that he was not a religious man. He was not interested in afterlife, both in Glimpses of World History, published in 1934, and his autobiography, 1936. He made it clear that he looked at religious sentiments with a very suspicious eye. And yet, despite saying all this, in a country which is supposed to be deeply religious, the autobiography was surprisingly popular. Have we changed today? Or something has happened? Gandhiji was extremely religious, in the true sense, I think, not sectarian, but he totally accepted Jawaharlal Nehru as his successor, as Sardar Patel himself said. Jawaharlal ji saying all the time at the same time comparing him with Lenin as friend of the poor, totally acceding to Gandhiji's wishes wherever Gandhiji was particularly emphatic. This told us, this was an example of how people who differ could still unite, could still combine. And the association between Mahatma Gandhi and Pandit Nehru was therefore particularly important because a debate went on all the time. A discussion went all the time. It was open, it was not secret. And yet, they united, they agreed on the most important things that mattered. And I think that also carries a message for all of us today, with all our political differences, cannot, on particular matters, all of us unite against the dark forces. I could enlarge on Pandit Nehru's other contributions to the national movement, but I would only say that even before independence, I think Jawaharlal Nehru was the one person who had in mind of what should happen if India would become free. And he knew that it would become free. There was a small incident which has nothing to do with his legacy, but which is perhaps an evidence of his strong conviction that freedom was bound to come, independence was bound to come soon. We were playing outside just after Cripps' mission at our house in Aligarh when he arrived in a Tonga. He had come to Aligarh addressing Congress meetings, and while Congress was a very strong and active party at that time in the national movement, so he had a vision, perhaps of all the Congress leaders, among all the Congress leaders, a detailed vision for what India would be like. And one word which was seldom used by others is always found in Nehru: secular. India would be a secular country. A vision of secular India, a vision of a socialist India. The Karachi Resolution was a prelude to socialism, an attempt to build socialism after independence. At least that is the notion in the glimpses of world history and in his autobiography. In the autobiography, he says Karachi Resolution can be implemented by any capitalist country. So obviously he meant that there would be further developments which would take India to socialism. Jawaharlal Nehru's socialistic pattern, which was accepted which was proposed in the Avadi Congress, was something which he had been dreaming of since late 1920s, that India would take to the path of socialism along with democracy. And he never ceased admitting that he was greatly influenced by Marxism, and in autobiography he says, I am very close to communist thinking. But he also had objections and reservations, undoubtedly. And his socialism was different. And I particularly like to point to his basic approach, a document in 1958, which was published by the AICC Economic Review, in which he says that the public sector should also allow, the planning should allow, not only public sector but also within limits and under planned under planned direction, a private sector. At that time, I remember we on the leftist side were very critical of this statement because it suggested that there can be a mixed economy and not socialist economy. But the experience, particularly in China and in other socialist countries, Vietnam, has also borne out the fact that if you have public sector without any element of private competition within an economy, then the public sector would not be successful. And therefore, I think that it was a very important conclusion that Jawaharlal Nehru drew from his actual experience as India built up the public sector, and as he realized that there should be some kind of partnership between a limited private sector. But a limited private sector. He was not a corporate sector man. And that's perhaps also one thing we should remember. India's welfare is not the welfare of the corporate sector. They are two different and distinct things. It may be, it may not be. And that's particularly important because of the present situation, which I will not dilate upon it, but the total predominance of the corporate sector is very bad for the health of the nation. And here we should therefore go back, I think, to Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru's paper on the basic approach, 1958. You must keep private sector under some limitations. Privatization of the public sector beyond a particular point, particularly where very substantive industries are involved, is a total rejection of the Nehru legacy. One is Nehru's vision of India as part of the world. He had a vision for the world also. Unlike other Congress leaders, he was not insular. If something happened to the Jews, he was perturbed. If something happened to the Arabs in Palestine, he was equally perturbed, as one can see from his letter to Einstein, which was written in late 40s, perhaps 50s, in which he greatly sympathized with the Arabs as far as Palestine was concerned, while he maintained his whole sympathy for the Jewish victims of Nazi terror as well. He believed that Indian freedom could be secured not only by peace, but also by freedom of other countries. And therefore, Asian Relations Conference of March 1947, before even India was free, this was a particular achievement of his. And then, of course, the Bandung Conference of 1954 and the non-aligned movement, of which he was practically the architect. India's role in Korean War, bringing Korean War to an end, is recognized by everyone. He had the same vision for the world, and opposition to apartheid in South Africa, and opposition to colonialism everywhere, particularly which was apparent in the Suez Canal crisis, where India joined Egypt against the position of all the Western countries. That also is a part of the Nehru legacy which we are forgetting now. Only business deals matter. Business deals favorable to the companies, Indian companies or foreign companies matter. Our principles are nowhere. Finally, and I'll end by a few remarks on secularism. One must realize that when Nehru spoke of secularism, he spoke under the impression that it meant what it means to the world outside India today. It means that the state policy shall be framed without reference to any religious requirement. Whatever is good for human welfare in this world, Holyoake said, would only be the consideration, not what you should do to earn a better position in the afterlife. Nehru, as you know, didn't recognize afterlife, and he was always very suspicious of the belief in God. So his secularism meant that you would be neutral, religions would be tolerated as a private affair, but it would be kept at bay, not allowed to influence policy. This was very important because the whole of Dharma Shastra, so to speak, was overthrown in 1955-56 with the Hindu Code. That too is a part of Nehru legacy. It didn't benefit all women, but it benefited 80% of them in India, more than 80%. And that was a big thing. So this was a secular state rejecting the entire religious law of the vast majority of the population after the majority of the population had voted for the Congress on a platform in which it had demanded, it had said that we will reform the Hindu Code to give inheritance and other rights to women, it had said. Now, Dr. Radhakrishnan, unfortunately, in his recovery of faith, has given a different version. That secularism in India, he says in India, as if India has a right to build secularism of its own sort, as if we have the right to change the meanings of English words, and therefore change the meaning of secularism in our constitution. He said that in India, we do not reject an unseen spirit. If a spirit is unseen, what's the fun of either rejecting or accepting it? But we do not reject relevance of religion to actual life. Now, there is nothing like religion. There are only religions. If you say, we want to do this, do all religions will say that yes, you can do it? Some will say, one religion will say no, another religion will say yes. So obviously, when you say religion is relevant to human life and to state policy, you must mean one religion. And then the next step is what the BJP takes, in fact, that the religion relevant to Indian life is not Hinduism, but Hinduism as they perceive it. Can you imagine anyone saying that religious instruction is one thing and instruction in religion is another? And therefore, you can have instruction in all religions. And therefore, under the Radhakrishnan definition, they have subverted the constitution. My other objection to that judgment is it's bad English, it's ungrammatical and unidiomatic. And it's unhistorical because it says all the values in the world have come from sons and saints, as if the French Revolution and Soviet revolutions gave us no values, as if already in the Vedas and the Quran, gender equality is proclaimed and democracy, representative democracy is established. So it is this kind of philosophy which now prevails. And it is therefore very important for us to go back to real secularism, to go back to Nehru, to read Nehru and what he says on these, to read Nehru on what he says, how majority communalism masquerades as nationalism. That particular judgment of Nehru is very valid. I would end by saying that now is the time to go back to the national movement and to go back to the vision of India that the founders of Free India had in mind. It's unfortunate that it should be so. We should have been going forward, but now we are being pushed backward, and therefore it is very important to study the Nehru legacy and to also the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi, also the legacy of other components of the national movement, whatever they have left behind. But Pandit Nehru is particularly important because he led free India in the first 17 years. And I think we should therefore build up platforms involving all kinds of political views which agree to this, that there should be a secular India, that there should be equal treatment for all, that the vision of India as enshrined in the Karachi Resolution, as enshrined in our Constitution should be followed. All those, whatever be their policy towards corporate sector or towards socialism or towards welfare state, whatever be their policy, but on one thing we can all unite, that India should be a democratic and secular republic. And even if there can't be electoral alliances, there can still be platforms, there can still be common movements, there should be common agitations, so that Indian people get what they are entitled to. They are entitled to pursuit of the vision that Jawaharlal Nehru had outlined for us. Thank you.